Wonderful. Well, welcome back to our open governance workshop. Again, my apologies at not announcing it earlier in the meeting. Yes, we've pulled it out of a public excluded environment so that we can talk about it openly. So I will pass the floor over to Jo, noting that we have in our agendas a workshop, folder that contains presentation. So I shall pass over to you, Jo. Welcome, and leave you to undertake the introductions.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to introduce you all to Stephen Hill. He is here from elections.com. He's come here to help us kind of look at this issue today in terms of representation reviews. He's doing a number of representations reviews around the country, and has delivered a number of these workshops to councils across the country. So I'm going to hand over to him to deliver the presentation, and I'll just be here to chip in as required.
Thank you, Jo. Kia ora koutou. Great to be with you, councillors, today, and very pleased to be working with you to help you through looking at the process for a representation review. As Jo said, we're working with 12 or 15 councils quite actively at the moment, supporting them through the representation review process. And in the next hour, I hope to just take you through an introduction to what the representation review process is all about, what the requirements are, and some of the key things that you as a council need to be considering. It is your process, they are your decisions. We are just here, both myself and staff, to support you, give you the information that you need, and to make sure that the process side of things is handled correctly and according to the statutory timelines and all the requirements that there are, some of which I'll go through today. Can I ask, first of all, how many of you have been through a representation review before? Great. It's excellent. So a number of you are familiar with the requirements of the Act. So if we could just have the first, thanks, Jo. I'll just take you through some background on the review. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at some of the background material already, but just to touch on it for you, the review is a statutory requirement. It's set out in the Local Electoral Act 2001. Every council has to go through the process. It's usually on a sort of turnabout time every 3 years. There's a different set of councils that are going through the process, but it must be undertaken at least every 6 years. It can be undertaken more frequently if a council wishes to. But at least a minimum of every 6 years, council must review all of its representation arrangements. And yours were last reviewed in 2021, 22, and also prior to that in 2018, 19. So in fact, in the last 2 electoral cycles, you have held a representation review. So this will actually make the 3rd consecutive electoral cycle that you have held a representation review, if you confirm that you will go through and do that this time around. So in actual fact, you're not required to do another review until the 2027 electoral cycle. You can do it, you can choose to do so, but you're not actually required to do that until 2027. You probably recall, those of you that were here last time, or if you've had a look at the background material, that 2021 review was referred to the Local Government Commission. They are the holders of the process, and they made the final determination on that with quite a lengthy and quite useful determination that was issued for that time around. So any new arrangements that you put in place through this review would be in place for the 2025 and 2028 electoral cycles, so the next 2 electoral cycles, unless you choose to hold another review before then. So the Act sets out all of the requirements that must be covered and must be included in your review and in the proposal, and these are essentially the questions that must be answered through this process. We have to specify a number of wards, how many there will be, what the boundaries of those wards will be, what the names of those wards will be, and also the number and boundaries of any community boards, what will be the total number of elected members and the number elected from various wards, what's the basis of election, will the councillors be elected by wards or at large or by some mix of wards and at large. And there's also the question of community boards, whether you retain or disestablish or establish new community boards. So all of those things are on the table and up for discussion this time around. As I mentioned, there is quite a firm statutory timeline that is in place for this process. And the current deadline that the immediate deadline that we're working towards with all of our councils is the 31st of July, which is the last date by which a council can resolve its initial proposal. That initial proposal must be one proposal. It's not a set of options to be voted on. It's one proposal that this is what the council is proposing to put in place for the next electoral cycle. And so that must be resolved by the 31st of July. Now, we currently have the bill before the House on looking at the arrangements for Māori wards. That may make a change to that final date for the initial proposal, but certainly our advice to everybody at the moment is work towards the current timeline, and let's wait and see where the legislative changes fall as that works its process through in Wellington. Once that initial proposal is resolved, which will be sometime before 31st of July, that kicks off a series of steps, which include notifying that proposal, public notification, and then opening it up for public consultation for a minimum of 1 month. So it's open for submissions. It is a formal process. You will make available the opportunity for submitters to be heard. So you'll hold hearings and deliberations on those submissions. And then you'll make a decision on your final proposal. So you may choose to stick with the initial proposal as you proposed it, or you may listen to submissions and feedback from the community and decide to make changes to that proposal, and that would become your final proposal. There is provision for appeals and objections to that final proposal, so it doesn't go out for consultation in the same way that the initial proposal does, but it is open to appeals and objections. And if any of those are received, they go to the Local Government Commission for determination. And that process must be concluded by the 10th of April next year. So that it's in time for the next electoral cycle. So just some background in terms of your process steps so far. You have already taken the decision to resolve to retain the first past the post voting system. So councils have the choice of FPP or single transferable vote. You've resolved that one already. You've also made your decision around Māori representation back in May 2021 with the resolution to establish a Māori ward from the 2022 election. So that is already in place under the statutory population formula, providing for one member to be elected. I have included a note there about the changes to the Local Electoral Act, which, as I mentioned, are currently working their way through the Select Committee and parliamentary process. Those arrangements are about reintroducing, or primarily for this context anyway, they are primarily about reintroducing the provision for a binding poll to be held. So as the situation was previously, reinstating that provision for binding polls to be held. As the transitional arrangements set out in the bill stand at the moment, any council will have to make a decision that's currently in that process. So for you, you will need to resolve either to disestablish the Māori ward, and that decision must be made by 6th of September, or you can decide to hold a binding poll as part of the 2025 local elections to decide whether the ward will continue. So that's the way the legislation is sitting at the moment. And so we're all watching and waiting to see how that process works through. But those decision points will be subsequent, and we're certainly advising councils not to rush into making those decisions until there's more clarity at this stage. So for now, we're working through the process as it currently stands, and this workshop is really a chance to kick that off. And I guess just to clarify really what the purpose of today's session is about, this is not a decision-making meeting, it's a workshop. And we're here as staff and advisors to provide some advice and provide background and context, but also to seek a steer from you as the elected members and initial indication of your views. First of all, on, are we proceeding with the representation review? And if so, to have an initial look at what the options for that review might be. Given the time that we've had so far to put this together, there's not been a time to model an extensive number of options or look at substantial boundary changes, but we do have some initial options for you to consider today. And then that will help inform the decision-making and the preparation of that initial proposal, which we're looking to resolve prior to the end of July. Current situation, obviously you're familiar with this, but just to, I guess, refresh and make sure that we start from a good background and a platform of understanding. The council currently comprises a mayor who is elected at large, that is across the whole district by all electors, and then 11 councillors who are elected on a wards basis from 5 wards. So there are the 4 general wards and 1 Māori ward, making up the current structure with the number of councillors that are noted there alongside each ward. And we also have 2 community boards, a Cambridge board and a Te Awamutu Kihikihi community board as well, with the number of members that are noted up there. I think it's useful to have a look back at the representation reviews that were carried out in 2018 and 2021. So in each of the last 2 electoral cycles, out of the 2018 review, that resulted in the council comprising a mayor and 13 councillors elected from 5 wards, and the 2 community boards, 6 elected and 2 appointed members in Cambridge, and 5 elected and 2 appointed in Te Awamutu. 2021 was quite a substantial representation review, and that review was required because the council took the decision to establish a Māori ward. So that's one of the things that process triggers. You do need to hold the representation review having taken that decision. So at that stage, the council proposed reducing the number of councillors to 11, so 10 general ward councillors and 1 Māori ward councillor. There was the merging of the Parongia and Kakipuku wards. There was the decision to retain the 2 community boards with some boundary changes. And interestingly, the majority of public submissions supported the proposal. Generally, community feedback through that process was positive. There was an appeal that was received that was seeking the disestablishment of the community boards. And so there being an appeal, even though it was only 1, it does need to go to the Local Government Commission for their review and determination. And essentially the Commission upheld the Council's proposal for ward representation structure. It thought that was sensible. They said that the ward structure broadly reflected the communities of interest across the district, which I think is an interesting observation. So the current ward structure reflecting communities of interest. And also they noted that those communities of interest reflected community feedback. So the general view that seemed to be coming back from the community was that that ward structure broadly reflected communities of interest. The Commission had the view that community boards are meeting the requirements for effective and fair representation, and that they noted the support from public submissions for community boards to be retained. They noted that the council had a proposal already in place at that stage to undertake a review of community boards, which was about improving the role and functions of community boards, and the Commission commended that proposal of the council, and in fact made a note that we look forward to seeing the results of that review in due course. So that's just a quick recap of where we got to after the last 2 reviews. Apologies if you can't see those numbers too well, but hopefully you've got them in front of you, and that's really just to, I guess, reiterate where we got to with the 2021 review. You see that the number of councillors, the population per councillor is noted in the 4th column across, and that's significant in terms of the fair representation requirements of the Act, because there needs to be relative equality of population per member across all of the wards. And some of you will be familiar with the plus or minus 10% rule. And so essentially that's about ensuring that the population per member across all the wards is within plus or minus 10% of the total population per member for the entire district. And so all of the wards in the 2021 review were compliant with the plus or minus 10%. So all sitting within that plus or minus 10% band. Okay, so having looked back a little, let's look forward and think about the current review process and think about what's changed since 2021, noting that it is only 3 years since the last review took place. And I suppose one of the key things is the population change in the district over that time. And using the Stats NZ population estimates as at 30th of June 2023, which is the data set that we use for this process, you can see the population change from 2020 through to 2023. Not so easy to make comparisons prior to 2018 because of the changes in ward boundaries, but you can see that the overall district population growth on those numbers has been 5.9% and relatively evenly spread across the district. 7.5 Cambridge, 4.7 for Te Awamutu Kihikihi, Parongia Kakipuku 9.7, and a decrease in Maungatautari.
May we ask questions?
Certainly.
Bearing in mind that the census is being released tomorrow, how confident are we that those 2023 figures estimated by Stats New Zealand are in line with the census figures that may come out tomorrow? Is there a chance that they may be different, or are they just giving us a kind of a preview of what they know the figures are going to be?
It's a good question, and everybody will be watching with interest to see what those census numbers do tell us. Stats NZ has always been reasonably confident that their estimates are robust and should be in line with where the census numbers fall. They won't be exact, but they should be within the ballpark, which is why the guidance has been that it's a robust and good set of data to use as a basis for the representation review. So we're not expecting substantial change, but we can have a look at that once those numbers are available.
Thank you.
Through you, Madam Chair. Yeah, well, another data set might also be a good prospect. I realise that you're tied to the legislation, but at the Zone 2 meeting that we were at for our sector on Friday, there was a proposal that we should be using more up-to-date data sets, for instance, the Infometrics one. Yeah, this is a remit that's going to LGNZ's AGM because Bruce Clarkson was saying that we are bound to use Stats NZ or census data, but it's always really out of date or subject to assumptions and quite long lags. Whereas we do have really good. We find the data that we get from Infometrics is up to the minute and credible for us. So why can't we, should we be maybe doing a comparison? Because we do know that our district has grown strongly, probably more than what I suppose has been forecast. Yeah. And I'm in the Parongia Kakapuku ward, which is pushing the limits for, the margins that we have to stay within. So I think I'd like to have accurate data.
Yeah, good comment. But unfortunately, we are tied by legislation at this stage, so it would need a legislation change to alter that basis.
But great to hear that there's talk of a remit coming through, so that there is that potential for change in the future. So that's positive. Okay, let's have a look then at how that population actually sits now. So bringing the latest data into the current ward structure, looks like the numbers that you have up on the screen and in front of you there. And you'll see that by and large, the wards are within the plus or minus 10%, with the slight exception of Parongia Kakapuku at 10.47%.
underrepresented, so very, very slightly outside the 10% margin. And I think we note further on in the presentation that it would probably only take a fairly minor boundary adjustment should we wish to do that to bring that into line.
Another question. And on that particular picture that we have there, and I'm assuming that although it's a Maori ward and basically it's a ward that covers the whole of the district, but it is, however, a ward still, and the ratio is still well within the 10%, and yet we don't seem to mention that the same 10% requirement applies, and yet it's within that 10%. So as it stands, that would meet the criteria. Is it no longer a requirement within the legal of the legislation that the Maori ward meets the same criteria?
That's correct. The plus or minus 10% criteria applies, or does not apply between Māori wards and general wards. So the population per member ratio is calculated under a separate formula in the legislation. And so that stands. And then if there were more than one Māori ward, you would have to apply the 10% within those wards. And within the general wards, you apply the 10% within those wards, but it does not apply between the Māori and the general wards because it is calculated separately under a statutory formula. So, yeah, as you see, the numbers fall pretty close to the allowable margins, which is, yeah, certainly a useful starting point in terms of where we head to next. So with that in mind, what are the factors that we do need to think about in the representation review? And again, many of you will be familiar with these. And there are three, I guess, key levers that we have to work with. And those are communities of interest, effective representation, and fair representation. Communities of interest is a fascinating topic. There are papers and papers that have been written on this. It's not defined in statute, but there are good guidelines that have been published by the Commission that help us to think about what those things mean. And they are things about how people perceive and identify with an area, how they live within an area, what services, facilities and things they access. So there's a functional part, there's a political dimension as well. And so communities of interest are how we think about the way that people relate to an area in which they live. And is that a sensible way of thinking about how we represent those communities of interest? So that helps us to think about what's the correct number of wards and how do we slice and dice the district to create those ward boundaries, which is a process that you as a council have been through a number of times already to land on the structure that you currently have. Then there's the question of effective representation, which is about saying, okay, so if we've identified those communities of interest, how do we best then arrange for good representation for those communities? So that's about thinking about the number of members, around about how many members is appropriate for the sizes of wards and the size of district that we have. And also what's the best basis for election? Is a ward structure the best? Is an at-large structure the best? Although a fully at-large system is not available to you because we have a Māori ward as part of the structure, or is some mix of wards and at-large a useful way of thinking about it? And then there's a fair representation, which is the plus or minus 10% requirement. I've already talked about that, so don't need to cover that off, but that's about ensuring there's some sort of approximately equal value in the population per member ratios. Just a couple of points that the Local Government Commission has made before, because they often come up with council's representation reviews. Often the question is asked, should we be basing our population numbers on future population projections? And that's where you can look at projections that you may have access to. And I guess the Commission's guidance and our advice would be, you'd certainly have that in the back of your mind, but it cannot be the guiding the guiding data set, if you like, or the guiding principle for setting the basis for your representation. We have to use the current data. We have to use the data sets that are in place at the moment. And there's some good sense behind that because you never know what might be around the corner. Population projections can be affected by all sorts of factors. Natural disasters, pandemics, all kinds of things may have significant impacts on population growth or decrease.
The ward catchments, are they the same as the rates catchments? Does that flow through? For example, Cambridge Town Hall is funded out of my ward, Mangatautri. If we went to rural at large, what happens then?
Yes, a good question, Mike, and I will answer that, Your Worship. So look, just in that regard, I think it was 2 representation reviews ago, because Stephen's pointed out that we have had a series of representation reviews. Look, we made a deliberate move to actually break the connection. So look, we used to have what we termed ward rates, and those ward rates were applied to the actual ward boundaries, very specific on that. We actually amended it, and we changed those ward rates to being area rates, and broke that link. So look, there is now no association between no exact association between the targeted rating areas and the electoral wards. There really was no need to have that in the first place.
Thanks, Ken. One of the other questions that's come up is the one of the question of remuneration. Local Government Commission has noted that it does often come up when elected members are deciding total councillor numbers, but their advice is that they do not consider representation reviews an appropriate mechanism to address remuneration issues. So yes, it's another one of those factors that will be in the back of your mind and can certainly be part of your thinking, but it is not. It's not recommended to build a representation review on remuneration as a significant factor. Thought it was interesting just to look at that effective representation question. So one of those is, what's the number of elected members? And this is just a table of comparison of the number of councillors in councils of a similar size. So looking at councils of 50 to 70,000 population and the number of members in each of those. So you'll see a bit of a spread there in terms of similar sized councils, generally between 10 and 13. And some of those include multi-wards, some of those include at-large wards. So there's a mix of structures, but in terms of the numbers, they generally fall between that 10 to 13 size. So to think about some possible options and ways of thinking about this, and again, without having the ability at this stage to look at significantly recarving or recasting the electoral boundaries, there are some options for us to consider. So the first option, of course, is that you simply retain the status quo without any adjustments, no need to do any boundary adjustments. And if that was the case, there is no need for a representation review at all. As we've already noted, you're not required to do a representation review this time around. So the status quo could certainly remain, and that is one option. To proceed with a review, you have the option of essentially keeping the status quo, but with some boundary adjustments, so changing the ward boundary structure. You can consider a new structure with fewer councillors. You could also consider more councillors if you wish to. So all of those questions are on the table. You could also consider a new general ward structure that has a mix of more urban and rural wards, and that's one that we can look at shortly. There may be other possible structures as well, but we've tried to keep the playing field reasonably small at this stage to give you some viable options to think about. So if we look at the first option under a review, this would be to retain the status quo, but with some minor boundary adjustments. And this really goes back to the table that we looked at just previously. So keeping the existing wards, keeping the existing number of elected members, but making a minor boundary adjustment, which we haven't yet modelled or mapped, but our initial view is that it would be reasonably straightforward. But that would be to bring the Parongia Kakapuku ward within the plus or minus 10% margin. Looking at the numbers, it would probably require a population shift of about 200 across that boundary at some point to achieve that, and that could be modelled. No other changes proposed under that option, and community boards then would be retained. Just giving you a map representation, so pretty much it looks exactly as things are now, but noting that there would be that minor boundary adjustment that we would model. So let's look at a different option, a different ward structure, which really gives us more of an urban-rural split. So this creates a new rural ward and reduces the total number of councillors to 8. So under this option, we would see a combining of the Maungatautari and Parongia Kakapuku wards to create what we've just initially called a rural ward. We do have to specify a name for that ward, and that would be discussed. There would be still the minor boundary adjustment to bring the ward within that plus or minus 10%, because that would still need to be required. All of the other wards would be compliant with plus or minus 10% requirement. It reduces the number of councillors, and there would be no other changes, community boards retained under that option. So this to give you a visual representation of how that would look, noting that there would be a minor boundary adjustment, but largely that model. It's the one that my colleague Warwick Lamp at Elections would refer to as the double yolk poached egg.
Roger, can you turn your thing on?
You couldn't in any way be specific about the two rural ward councillors. They could both come from the same rural town, for instance.
Could be way,
Yeah.
one way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. They could come from anywhere within the district, in fact, because a person doesn't have to live within a particular ward boundary. So no, that's correct. Okay. Another option would be what we've termed an east-west split. This also sees a reduction of councillors down to 9. And under this option, we would combine the Maungatautari and Cambridge wards to create an east ward. That's just an interim name. We would need to specify a name for that. And combine the Te Awamutu and Parongia Kakapuku wards to create a west ward. So reduce the number of councillors to 9, retaining community boards. And I guess we just note in this one that there is, while it creates a tidy structure, there is perhaps less provision for dedicated rural representation. And we think there would be challenges for that in terms of meeting the communities of interest test. And visually, the ward representation would look like that. That's using the existing ward boundaries as the basis for the split.
That's actually interesting, isn't it? And I take it that the boundaries that you've used on that, is that the existing boundary?
Yes.
So in terms of the region, it's reasonably pretty evenly split.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting that.
Okay, a fourth option that we have just done some initial modelling on. Again, I don't think this is one that would meet the communities of interest test, but this would be, as opposed to the last one being east-west, a north-south split. But effectively, it becomes a Cambridge and the rest of the district split effectively, but it is an option for reducing the number of councillors to 8. So the Cambridge ward would be retained, The other 3 wards would be combined to create a South Ward with a reduced number of councillors and no other changes there. And again, I think that has some issues around rural representation, and it has some issues around communities of interest, but it's there as a, one way that the split could be considered. It does create a very large rest of the district ward.
Did you do the one about Te Awamutu versus the rest? Sorry, don't answer that. That was
Yeah.
an aside.
Yeah. Okay, on the question of community boards, as we mentioned earlier, does have to be on the table. You are required to consider and review community boards as part of this process. So you must determine whether there should be communities and community boards, and what the structure of any community board arrangement will be. That includes, their boundaries, their names, the number of members, all of the factors that we mentioned earlier. So that does have to be on the table as part of the review. And so I guess just a couple of notes to draw you back to 2021, where there was quite an amount of attention put on the community boards at that time. And the proposal in terms of community boards was endorsed by the Commission. And as I noted earlier too, it commended the Council's proposal to undertake that review, which I understand has recently been completed. And I suppose one of the issues to consider, given the time frame that remains to us, is that it would be challenging to carry out the level of engagement that would be recommended to engage with communities over over any significant changes to community boards if that was proposed. Part of the process for representation reviews is to hold, if possible, preliminary engagement. This is separate and prior to the formal consultation that happens after you have resolved your initial proposal. It's not mandatory, it's not set in statute, but under the Local Government Commission's guidelines and good practice over many years, it is recommended to engage with the communities to seek feedback, particularly where significant changes are proposed, and get the views of communities. Some councils take their communities through 2 stages of preliminary engagement. First stage, often to just gain general views as to how community feels the current arrangements are working, any issues that they see, any problems that are identified, and then use that to work up options, which are then often also tested with communities. So it is important, especially where communities are potentially facing significant change. It's an opportunity to get general feedback on the representation, but also feedback on any possible boundary changes and any community board changes. And it's important to note that, as I mentioned earlier, the initial proposal, when you resolve that, can only be one proposal, one option. So this is the only opportunity that you have to test different options if that's what you wish to do. So that preliminary consultation or preliminary engagement can be quite an important stage to go through. And that brings us to the fact that we have limited time available for that engagement. It's doable. We've got a slot, we've got a window in there, but it would probably be shorter and less extensive than the kind of engagement that we would normally recommend is carried out. So I guess just to summarise some of the issues around the review, some of the risks that you may face in terms of going through this review. And the first one is to simply ask the question, why is a review needed? Particularly given that a review was carried out in 2021 and prior to that in 2018. So there is no requirement to review now. That's of course not to say that you cannot choose to do so now, but just a question for consideration. That 2021 review did include quite wide-ranging consideration of both wards and community boards by the Commission, which came down with the view that it largely endorsed, or it did endorse the proposal that was put in place that changed. And so that raises the question, well, what has changed and what are the drivers for another review this time around? The population pressure is on the numbers at least, not significant. There's only been minimal shift from that plus or minus 10% requirement around fair representation. And so, what are the issues that are to be addressed? I think there's a question around the time that's available to us to go through this process. Again, it's doable. We can get it through, but it certainly would be a truncated process from what we would normally see, and from most councils that we have been working with. Some for up to 12 months already to get to this point. That raises questions around, is there sufficient time for good quality engagement with the community and with stakeholders, and the impact on staff time and resources to support the work.
Could I have a question on that? I'm unsure whether it's to yourself or to Joe or maybe even to Ken, but in terms of staff time and resources, how much would it cost to run the representation now? What's the cost estimate of that as a project?
A bit uncertain at this particular point in time. I suppose the thing is, if you decide that you want to embark on this process, we will kind of look at time required, but also look at, if we're going to be engaging with the community, we'll need a budget for communications and engaging on that forum. So we would go to prepare that. In terms of staff time, is very much going to depend on how much engagement we do get from the community, and how many people will get responding to early engagement, how many submissions we get on the initial feedback. And then again, also, like, staff time is very much dependent on that appeals process at the other end, because that can take quite a lot of staff time. But a lot of in terms of staff time, it is very hard to quantify at this juncture.
But there could be a reasonable cost.
It can. It depends. Yeah. If you get a lot of engagement, a lot of feedback, it can involve a lot of time in terms of this representation review process. They're not quick.
That's right. And if we were, let's say, the potential of legislation on Maori wards, that if we did go to a poll on Maori wards, which I don't think we're going to disestablish it beforehand, but if we did go for a poll, they would have to do another representation after that poll. So that would be 2 representations within a period of 12 months, basically.
Binding poll is significantly different, though. Can I just ask Lisa, perhaps, to give us an indication of what that engagement process, preliminary or otherwise, could look like? Is that okay, Lisa? Is it?
Hand me the microphone. Perfect. Okay, so we have met and had preliminary discussions on what the pre-engagement and the engagement process may look like. In terms of pre-engagement, the timeline is tight. However, it is doable. We'd probably look at pulling together a survey with some of those need to know questions or want to know questions. We would be using both traditional media and digital media for that, and very much pulling on our key stakeholders to try and get the pre-engagement messages out there. In terms of engagement, then that would just, as a SCP process, would be following our traditional format with those.
Thanks for that, Lisa.
I've noted there the potential impacts of the legislation on the Māori wards. As you're aware, if the council decides to rescind or to hold a poll, then that can trigger a review as well, as we've just discussed. So yeah, there are going to be a number of councils that are facing that prospect of completing this current review and then turning around and looking at another one further down the track, probably earlier than they were otherwise intending. There is the possibility of appeals and objections. If there was any aspect of the proposal that was not compliant, for example, around the plus or minus 10%, predominantly that issue, or if there were appeals or objections to the process, that would trigger a review and referral to the Local Government Commission. And what's interesting is that once it's referred to the Commission, they look at the entire process, not just the thing that the appeal was about. They will open up their review to look at the whole process, how and how the council has come to the decisions it's made, and will make its determination based on all of those factors. So everything is on the table effectively once it goes to a commission appeal.
That question, the fourth line, what was the fair and effective representation issue to be addressed? Is that a legal test somewhere in legislation, or is that just a challenge from you?
No, that's just a question for you to consider as you move forward, yeah.
So that's not something that the Commission would be considering as such?
No, well, fair and effective representation are part of the statutory requirement. So that has to be, you have to meet those requirements in the proposal that the council adopts. So this is really just a question about what is the basis and the need for the review at the moment.
Given the fact that we currently just exceed our fair representation by approximately 200 people, is there any way in which we can address that by any specific motion of council without going to, like, can we do a boundary review without having to go through the full representation process?
So I think go back to the question that there is actually no need to do anything about it. The fact that it's fallen outside the 10% now with the population stats does not trigger any requirement to do a review or to make any boundary change. This current situation can stay in place until the next time you are required to do a review.
So in fact, it's not broken.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So just to wrap up, I guess, thinking about where to from here, what staff are looking for is confirmation that the review will proceed. Then we would start working towards the preliminary engagement, as long as we have a good clear steer on which option or options you would like to move forward with. Second workshop in late June, 25th of June. At that stage, we would receive any feedback from the community engagement and confirm the initial proposal, which would go to the council on 30th of July to resolve. And that would trigger the public notification and consultation process and work through the timeline from there.
Cool. Just a point of clarification. If we were to proceed with this, presumably because we're not addressing anything in respect of a review around community boards, nor are we addressing anything in respect of the Māori ward matter, it's only really, would only be a very small and narrow kind of engagement. So that's not really going to be full blown, massive renovation and revolution, if you like. It's quite on quite a narrow point, one would assume.
Yes, that's correct. And you can make that preliminary engagement quite focused, quite targeted, but you need to inform the community at the same time that we're not proposing changes to these other areas. This is the only thing that we're looking at.
Yeah, not wholesale change, just on that narrow point. Cool, thanks for that. Claire?
Yeah, thanks. You've set it out really well. So I just want to sort of satisfy myself that with the question of the Māori ward review, that what if we pursued, a representation review that covers the general wards, that it's not going to be seen to sort of be, I suppose, not, prejudicing in any way that, that legislative process around the Māori wards, so that people might ask, well, why are you doing the general wards? Shouldn't you actually have some more certainty about the Māori ward and then do a combined review, later on or something? I mean, one of the drivers, I think, for us is we want something in place for the general wards that could go into the 2025 election. Yeah, and so by delaying, I suppose, a more coordinated approach, we might be, cutting ourselves off at the pass and not being able to do that. But I do want it to be seen to be fair. I mean, I feel that the legislated requirements around the Māori ward review, we're kind of bound by that anyway. And I feel it can be a separate process, but I just wanted a bit more, I suppose, if you could give us a bit more commentary about that.
Certainly. I think one of the things, first of all, to keep in mind is that the decision that the council has already taken on the establishment of a Māori ward stands and is effectively not subject to any change in the representation review. You would include it in your proposal, so you would make sure that you make it quite clear that we are retaining the Māori ward as per the council decision. So you're confirming that that is the proposal that you want to see as part of the wider district structure moving forward. So there is an element of confirming that current structure, even though it's not technically subject to consultation through that process, although we know that councils will receive feedback and submissions on Māori wards as part of that process. But technically that decision now stands and is not subject to change. Yep.
Yeah, this isn't about the Māori ward. That's a completely separate issue, and there's no sort of real connection in terms of raising the issue for conversation and review now.
Well, I think it'd be helpful if we did have that messaging that, at the moment we are letting that decision stand about the Māori ward, as part of this process, and that, it's really the general wards that we're looking at.
Monty?
I might be getting slightly too specific here because I might be diving into one of the options, but the rural wards being at large, or the rural positions being elected at large, doesn't work for me. It's probably the only problem in this. I think we should still have, if we're pursuing this, we should still have 2 rural wards, 1 east, 1 west. It's not one you've modelled, but I think there are quite distinct communities of rural interest between the east and the west, depending on which service town is your primary go-to. And I think it's, that's my problem with option 2. If we could draw a line through option 2 that made the numbers work, I think it'd be better. But
I think also from my point of view, there is a distinction between a rural representation and an urban representation, and I'd certainly like to see that rural representation continue. And I think I agree with you, the difference between east and west is wise to be returned.
All right. Hey, I'm not opposed to this. I'll start with that statement. But just you sit here thinking of all the options, and that page 13 was sort of interesting. And it gets back to that question you sort of put forward of the why, and is there a big enough why? And hey, to be honest, the more I look at this, I'm wondering whether there is a big enough why. Because it seems at the moment we're probably within cooey of where we should be, looking at all those other sort of similar councils. Also interesting that, hey, predicting growth shouldn't really become a big factor, and also remuneration shouldn't really be a factor that should be a decent driver in this. I guess the other thing is, for me, traditionally, when we've done these reviews, at least the last couple, we have looked at community boards as well. I'd like to know why we're not, and I'll throw it on the table that maybe because this is found a little bit rushed. That a review, why wouldn't you look at a review of the whole political scene, not just an aspect of it? I'm just throwing ideas out there I'm thinking of. That on Monty's thing, I'm not so big on it. I'm not so worried about that. There's only 4 options here. But again, there's 4 options. In 2018, I think there was 22 options at a workshop, for instance. It might have been, say, the equivalent of this. So there's obviously a lot more options that could come out of this that can't be considered here today. This is not a decision-making sort of meeting. So I do wonder whether staff are sort of, how well we're set up to deliver this in the time frame. You can deliver anything, but it's delivered well. Which brings me to one of my last things around the optics of this, is that we did a review in 18, 21, 24. just the optics of, does this look like a stable council when we're constantly under review of this? When I think personally, I'm struggling with the big why, selling the why to the community. Yeah, so now that was it, just food for thought. I mean, I'm not against it. I'm just trying to put my community head on here and just the optics and just the big rationale, because I'm always big into the why.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. I guess the conversations around this topic, Genesis sort of began in considering this review in the context of wider local government change. And bearing in mind, there's been considerable work done in this organisation on an operational level around what potentially does our organisation look like post Three Waters reform, if that indeed happens. Hence the notion around development of the great body of work around anchor institutions and our dipping our toe into the participatory democracy model, development of our spatial plan. There's kind of a whole lot of evolution taking place, right? Albeit slowly, local government world evolution. And my question, I guess my challenge to our elected members was, are we honestly saying that this format that we have before us now is fit for purpose going forward? So that was the question, I guess, and the challenge that I'm kind of putting to ourselves here. And to a certain extent, it may mean that some of us are turkeys voting for Christmas, and I can hand on heart say that I did that last time in terms of the merger of my then ward, Kakapuku, into the larger Western rural ward. I think we need to be brave and we need to be leaders. And granted, there's a page here reflecting on where everybody else is at, but we've never been just followers in Waipa. We need to actually be leaders. And I had a really good conversation with Sam Broughton. Selwyn are undertaking a similar review at the moment, and they're proposing reduction of numbers as well. And I guess my question for you, Stephen, is of the 11 or 12 councils that you're working with currently, how many of them are proposing a reduction of elected members in their council tables? I'd be curious to understand that.
There are some that are proposing a reduction in the number of general councillors, but those are generally cases where they are adding a Māori ward for the first time. So I think we're predominantly seeing relatively status quo numbers across most councils, but for some that means fewer general ward councillors and the addition of Māori ward councillors.
Thanks for that, which of course is what we did last time. So I guess I'm trying to put out a bit of a challenge there to really honestly say, do we think this model is fit for purpose? And I guess I kind of look at this data and I look at the legislation, and I appreciate that the legislation is what it is. But I guess I fall on the terminology effective representation, and numbers doesn't equal effectiveness. That's the flaw I think we fall into. Everybody thinks that, okay, if we're growing, we need more people, that therefore equals effective representation. I challenge that notion. It's quality that produces effective representation, not numbers. So anyway, that was, I just want to see whether we're brave enough to actually ask that question. And it's only on a very refined point in terms of the numbers around our elected table. And you have to also remember that this question or conversation has arisen off the back of a significant Community Board 2.0 review and the implementation plan that came from that. I guess we've got to think bigger. We've got to think about this group being a higher level, more strategic governing group. And are we honest about our intention to devolve more power to those community board groups? Because that's essentially what we've proposed in our implement plan, and we're not doing it. So this is, to my mind, part of actually putting our words in action. And so for me, that would be the next step later, being clearer about what the community board responsibilities and roles could be. And that's making decisions about the way that we want to govern our district and not relying on future for local government reviews to be picked up, because I'm telling you right now, they're not likely to be. So we've got to say what's right for Waipa and be honest about whether we think this is a fit for purpose governing group going forward. Hence the conversation. Philip, then Roger.
Yeah, just thanks for your report or your presentation. Just sort of going on a little bit from what Mike was saying, you know, and what you your comment was that, we've reviewed it the last two times, every 3 years, or for the last two terms. And we're not necessarily needing to do it for another 6 years. So what is the, with regards to workload for staff, and is the public going to say, well, you should be addressing there may be other more important issues. And with regards to people that sit around the table, it's a team effort. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. It may not necessarily be strategic people. There may be more, other strengths as well. So it is a team effort as well. So it's not just about focusing on one type of person sitting around here. So yeah, but the question is, we're going to do it again in another 3 years' time, and I questioned that a few weeks ago as well, and even 3 years ago, 6 years ago. Yeah.
Yep.
Roger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can see exactly where you're coming from through the chair. And I agree with a lot of what you're saying. But if we're going to do another one in 2015, we can do exactly what you're saying then. And again, we can have more time to better prepare. I'm of a similar mind to Mike. I think we're looking at a very short time frame to get an effective consultation going in the time that we've got. And I'm just a little bit cognizant of perhaps a little bit of a breakdown in our consultation processes recently. So I think, we should be aware we don't want another restricted period actually creating some community reaction. So I'd prefer to leave it until the next one and do exactly what you're talking about then in 2015, when we're going to have to do one anyway. Because I think in terms of the options that we're given, the poll is the option that we would be going for. We don't, certainly not going to disestablish it now. So I think leave it until we do the fuller consultation process in 2025, not 15, sorry, 25.
Thank you, Roger. Claire, no, and then you.
Thanks. I do support doing a review now, because I don't want to go into the 2025 election with the same, I suppose, size of councillor role that we have at the moment. I think I agree with Susan that we need to look forward to what we can see the changes are coming in local government and what implications that has for the councillor role. I can see that in the past, it was okay for us to have a meeting a week, and an agenda given to us. And a lot of us are actually working on that model. You come along on a Tuesday and you've read your agenda and you give feedback to the staff. Okay, but there's another side of this now where we're getting involved in collaborative groups, we're engaging more in stakeholders, and we've got some really big issues that we're trying to grapple with and work out how local government can take leadership in roles, like affordable housing, and well, the water space as well is a big challenge as well, climate change. That's on top of that coming along once a week, And so, I'm one of these people where, yes, I come along once a week, but I'm also going out about 3 other days a week to other meetings, all right? Now, some of you guys, you've already got other jobs, okay, and you can commit to that 1 day a week, all right, and you're fulfilling that requirement. But the job's got bigger for a lot of us. So I'm keen on having a bigger role that's pitched to the community and encouraging other people to stand. And I've heard feedback from people, yeah, I'd like to do it. I'm really committed to my community. I can see the value of this role, but I can't afford it because, it's only a part-time role, or I'm still going to have other income and things like that. So I'm not saying it's completely to do with the pay, But it is, I suppose I'm saying it's the size of the role now, and I can see how that's going to evolve over time. There was a comment made about if we're doing another review now, it looks like we're not a stable council. We've had so many reviews in the past, but I must say the previous one was totally driven by our desire to set up a Māori ward. Yeah, so, and I think people need to recognise that. And I just go back to that comment that local government is an evolving space and we need to respond to it. I'm happy with not having the community boards involved at this point for a review, because it's recognised the importance of that review that we've done on improving the effectiveness, and I feel we're not quite finished yet. You know, we're still trying to get that in place, bedded in, and achieve those improvements. So I'm comfortable with not including a review of that. And lastly, Monty mentioned about the rural ward split, or like the rural ward at large and east-west. So yeah, I'd support his approach as well, that I would be interested in looking at it. Yeah, I do agree that there's a difference in those communities of interest. And if that was a possible option, yeah, I'd be keen to see it. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Claire. Philip, then Andrew.
Yeah, just really real briefly, I think Mayor Susan asked the question about whether the other 12 that you're reviewing have reduced. It was around that the ones that we're introducing a Maori ward. So as we've already got a Maori ward, which is great, it seems like we're not one of those groups.
Andrew and then Monty.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, basically, I'm not going to reiterate what Claire said. I pretty much agree with virtually all of it. But I am just going to say the 2018 review we had to do because the 6 years were up, my memory's telling me. And we didn't allow ourselves enough time to do what we wanted to do, I think, around the table. Ended up with 13 councillors by default, basically, because of the, you know, the population growth in Cambridge. So, yeah, I guess just that. I'm for going forward.
Thanks, Andrew. Great clarification. Monty.
Look, I'm just probably quickly stating my position, and Mike and Roger and Philip, good to hear your sort of notes of caution. It's always good to have that. My inclination is probably still to do this, to go for the change. It's relatively minor, but this is quite a big group, and I think it would function more effectively a little bit smaller. And I actually think it would work better with the community boards. It would do more, I think, to get that governance representation kind of model working well. So I hear your caution, but my inclination is still I'd be into it.
Thanks, Monty. Mike.
Yep, thanks for that. Yeah, hey, look, as I said, I'm not opposed to this. I'm just trying to give a balanced perspective here. Hey, the other thing is, and Mayor Susan, you alluded to, like, through this, there could be more work on the for the community boards, and that's something. If we go through this, that I think we need to treat them as, you know, some fairly major stakeholders in this, because, you know, the remuneration bit is they get paid not a lot of coin, and it's just how much you can throw on that group. I totally understand that we can use them different, but if it's a philosophy of, you know, taking of 25% of councillors out and then throwing, you know, some of that work onto them, they'd want consulting with pretty early. So yeah, like I say, I'm not against this. I'll just put some points forward just to be considered. But I'd like to see, obviously, a whole bunch more options come forward than just the time frame of the 4. And hey, I was one of those folks that did come in 2018 where, you know, this table went for 13 councillors, and the Cambridge Community Board came in and asked for 10. So it's and we asked to reduce the community board as well, which in the end we happened. So we don't mind voting, you know, turkeys voting for Christmas. It's just about being efficient. So all good.
Thanks, Mike. Marcus, and I think then Liz.
Yeah, I just want to agree with Claire's comments and your comments. I think it's time to be proactive about it and work ourselves to a smaller size so that we can be more strategic and more nimble.
Yeah. Look, I don't have a problem with the review. I think that our environment's just changed so greatly as well, and what's happening to our communities seems to be constantly changing. So we should always answer that call. And I don't think it's a big change, just reducing potentially some council representation is not a huge change for me. I feel confidence in our team, our comms team delivering an effective consultation. I don't think that there'd be too many issues here. We've been through this not that long ago, so there's probably a lot of what we can do that can be repeated. Future-proof, got 2 different committees for that, all the collaborative groups, a lot of the groups Claire said, stakeholders, our roles have changed. Our roles have absolutely changed. We are pulled in so many more different directions. And I know, you know, the community that, well, Waipa, they want some of us every day. Every single day. And they want us to be able to answer their questions. They want to understand the strategic plan, the technical detail. And I know, you know, a lot of us are able to tee in with staff, which is great, but there is an expectation from our community now that we have a certain standard and a level that we can deliver, especially when we're delivering speeches and competent in the you know, information that we give. So I support the review. I quite liked option 2 actually, but I take on board the rural stuff. I look around, I look at the history and I look at that, it's been such a mix of rural people in town wards. I mean, I'm a great example. We've always sort of been mixed all over the place anyway, but I appreciate that, and perhaps, you know, we can look at those options again, see if there's something else that might be a better fit for the time.
Thanks, Liz. Any other comments? Okay. Yeah, interesting the whole notion of communities of interest. It's a very peculiar one, isn't it? And I guess, I mean, I sit slap bang, I don't think anybody's more central in this district than me. And although there are differences in the communities, I don't know that, I think there are probably more commonalities in terms of the community's interests than there are differences when it comes to the rural communities. Sure, they might tend to shop at one place more than the other because of its proximity to a town, but I tend to see commonality more than difference in all honesty. And I guess, strangely enough, being raised at Rukahia up near we face the city. We didn't really look back here. So the whole notion of, you know, communities of interest is kind of a moving one depending on where you're standing in the district, I think. So it's a tricky one to hang your hat on that whole thing and say, yes, that's the clinical scientific answer, because it actually isn't. It's a very nuanced geography defining and space finding kind of notion, I guess. So look, my sense is that there is an appetite for a review on that narrow point and that narrow point alone. I'm just flicking back here. So that's your guidance in terms of whether we review or don't. And then you're seeking guidance, is this right, on initial consultation, consideration of options. So you really want us to sort of give some steer or warmth or coldness. It's like that. Remember that game you used to play as a kid? Hot, cold, cold, cold. Remember that one?
Yeah.
So we're hot, cold towards anything here, putting it out there.
Can I just go through you?
Sorry, Lou, I couldn't see you there.
Sorry, yeah. I just wanted to mention something here, that we as a council adopted a Maori ward. Now, I think it's critical that we actually confirm that, all right, in this current environment. We're talking of reviews and everything else, but we need to have that confirmed so that we say openly that we support that. I feel if we go through a review and, as I say, in that review, lose that option, we've lost something very important. The other thing I'd like to make a comment on is that we're facing lots of legislation. I know the agenda that's down in Wellington at the moment is phenomenal, and part of that is local government. So they are looking at quite significant changes within our parameters. You're operating on what is quite an elderly act. It was written quite some time ago, and they are looking at that. So what I'm trying to make the point here is that under our current legislation, we are compliant. If we take changes now, we run the risk of perhaps precluding something that's going to happen a little later on, particularly, I think, with remuneration, particularly with the concept of local body representation. So I just want to offer a note of caution from an elderly point of view, that I've seen many, many things where we jump forward a little bit too quickly. We have an option at the moment to retain status quo. And I believe that with the complaint of having an annual plan to complete in the near future, in the next year, having a new chief executive, having a complete workover is probably not the greatest idea, particularly with a situation that we as a council, I feel, work very well together. We have a very, very good team environment. It was notable yesterday at a meeting with how well it works. Now, I just would make that note of caution.
Thanks, Lou. Liz.
I'm just a bit worried. I'd quite like a show of hands to understand who is in support of the review and who's not. I'm just not too sure where we've landed.
Yeah, okay. Just before we do that, Lou, there's in terms of our council's position around our collective position in respect of Māori wards, that matter was discussed recently at a council meeting, and it was agreed that a letter would be written. That letter has been written to the minister with our position, and I recently, as last week, co-signed the Local Government New Zealand joint letter along with 51 other mayors supporting Local Government New Zealand's position in terms of opposing that piece of legislation as it stands. So I don't know how more public we can be, Lou, on that one. And certainly there's no intention in terms of this discussion today it's not about the Māori ward. This is about it's about our functioning as an elected membership into the future, with the certainty that we've supported our position around and made publicly our support for that position around the Māori ward. So that's not an influencing or impacting decision in respect of this discussion from my perspective. Dale Marie.
This is just me wanting to know, are we going to put our resources and our monies in the right way when we do know that we will be getting a decision about the Māori ward soon? I just don't want to see us doubling up and us having to waste money if we have to do it twice. Is there a way that we can do this after the decision so that we don't have to waste twice? That's all I'm thinking about, is not having to, I don't know, but it's just we're tasked with being prudent. And I know the position of our council is that we want to keep the role that I have, but I'm just worried that we're going to use too much.
Monty.
Just seek clarification following that. If the binding poll is in favour of keeping a Māori ward, that doesn't trigger a review, right? It's only if it pans it.
Right.
Yeah. So that is the case, right? Yeah.
Right.
So, and in respect of the review we're talking about, it's not a wholesale review. I think we've established that. It's on that finer point. So the cost that we keep referring to, I think, is a little bit of a red herring personally, because we're talking about future fit for purpose, which is, if you get that wrong, that's a lot more costly. Mike, before I ask for a show of hands.
Yeah, I totally agree with that comment too. Hey, so the 4 proposals, in terms of review, is that just the start of the proposals? Or is there going to be like more that we thrown in the mix? That's my question.
Well, I mean, I suppose you've raised an issue around the table today, just in terms of that option 2 that was proposed. If we go back to that, because that's that combined rural ward, and there was some discussion that was considered too large, and you would like that split up. That would require re-looking, because you can't retain the current rural wards that you've got with the reduction down in numbers, because we can't make the numbers work with the plus or minus 10%, which is why those 2 wards were combined. So we would need to if you wanted us to look at it, we would have to kind of see, would we, Stephen, as to whether there was another line that could be drawn in that purple area that's still aligned with the communities of interest in terms of a split. That's kind of the one we've heard today.
Yeah, and in order to make the numbers work, we might actually have to take some population out of the townships into the rural areas to make those numbers work. So there's a bit of modelling work. I can't predict what that would be, but there's a bit of modelling work would be required. And I guess just to point out that the current status quo is effectively an east-west rural split. But that does give you that east-west, but that only works with the slightly larger numbers.
So can I just, for the sake of clarity, the opposition, the option 2, the new mega Māori, mega rural ward, for want of a better word, there are 2 members denoting that, or to come from the area. Is there no way of finding a line somewhere there? You must be able to divide the rural community into even halves somewhere there. Appreciating you've got a beautiful maunga right in the centre there, which is a bit of a challenge. But I mean, I sit very near the boundary presently. Can there be work done around potentially finding where a boundary between the 2 east and west rural wards could be?
I think. Oh, sorry. Can I cut in there? Oh, sorry, Gary. Yeah, look, I think the team is saying that on the plus or minus 10% it would be thrown out unless, unless there is significant changes to the urban boundaries to compensate. Yeah, this whole thing needs to be compliant with the plus or minus 10%, and to to achieve that, that line remaining, there will have to be changes not just within the rural wards. If this was just changing the rural ward boundary and slipping some people either east or west, that would be easily achievable. But we still need to retain relativity with the urban wards, so there'd have to be some rural urban ward boundary changes.
Susan, can I just follow that?
Well, I suppose given the timing constraints, I mean, one option if you wanted to look at another solution would be to go out with a very generic early engagement survey, which didn't really look at options. So to give time, then while that survey was out for engagement, then we could work on this other solution and then present that to the workshop on the 25th of June. That would mean, no, you wouldn't be doing any early engagement with your community on 2 options. And as Stephen has already told you, you can only present 1 option in your initial proposal. So, that is one way of doing it. It's not ideal.
I just want to get Lisa's feedback on that one as the guru.
Through you, Your Worship, we could find a way in the way that we word the questions to, for the responses to provide guidance on urban, rural.
That sounds good. Any other feedback before we?
I mean, while I'm in favour of the east-west rural, I mean, I'd be quite comfortable with consulting on the mega rural as well. And I think that's kind of what Lisa's alluding to, that we could, have the questions so that we do get feedback on that particular issue. Because in fact, that kind of sounds like that's one of the big questions we would like resolved.
Cool. Look, I think it's probably time we drew this workshop to a close, but I think you've been given a fairly clear steer. Maybe if we just chuck our little paws in the air for those who are comfortable with proceeding with a review at this point, subject to obviously those small. Okay, so that's the majority's comfortable with progressing.
I'm happy with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So does that give you the steer that you require, Stephen and Jane?
Yeah, I think so. Perhaps just for clarity, so that we are clear, in the pre-engagement, we would be looking at surveying essentially the status quo, because that should be in the mix. The option 2, which is the new rural ward with 1 rural ward, and then a rural ward with 2 rural wards, the east-west split. Essentially, some framework around those 3 approaches.
Yep, that seems to be what I've heard. Yep, lots of nodding of heads. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Hey, look, thank you very much for your time, people, today, and to you, Stephen, for coming and stepping us through your paper. So in terms of the next steps there, well, they're all there for us and you covered them off at the end. So thank you very much for that.